I just want to welcome you all very warmly to the new school and to the closing convening, the first of two closing convenings for freedom of speech, a curriculum for studies into darkness. My name is Karen Cooney. I'm the director of the Wherein Center, and for the last year and a half, together with co-curator Laura Rajkovic and actually many of you, we have tried to shape and mold and go really deep with this question of what freedom of speech means in this country at this moment. Where we are today is the first time I think we're convening in this space. It is called the Star Foundation Hall. It was the foundation itself was funded by a Cornelius van der Star, who was an insurance magnate who passed away in 1968 and set up one of the largest private foundations in this country. Insurance is a strange business of projecting into and selling the anticipation of the future without the investment that education or a university might make into the future. And as the naming of this hall makes clear, the new school is complicit with both the educational and also the insurance endeavor associated with this enterprise. Encased by wood, Star Foundation Hall sits below the ground, as you undoubtedly noticed, but above one of the main water mains of New York City that actually exploded a couple of days after the inauguration of this building, and the result was that this entire floor was inundated and flooded by extraordinary volumes of very, very powerful water streaming through this space. And there are videos online that are kind of exhilarating. Below the water mains, deeper down, is the Manhattan schist rock bed, and then deeper still, eventually we get to magma and lava and all of that. All of this is also Lenape Hoking. It is unceded land of indigenous peoples, among them the Lenape. And I would like to ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. The New School and the Wherein Center also acknowledge that it was founded, or that they were founded, upon exclusion and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those whose land is now occupied by this auditorium. This acknowledgement, we hope, demonstrates a commitment to beginning, at least, the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism. Tonight, we're presenting you the first half of the closing convening on freedom of speech. The prompt, as some of you may remember, came from an unexpected corner. A year and a half ago, maybe it was even 2 years ago, at Documenta in Athens, after the presentation, the screening of one of the most amazing artworks I've ever seen, Such a Morning, film by Barque Anwar, Anwar walked up to me. We had known each other for a couple of years, and said, I'd like to invite you to mine and follow some of the ideas in the film and mine and look at that which we do not know, which could be signified by darkness. What would be the issue that in your community would like to understand better? What is dark in your space? That was a very easy prompt in a way, because we instantly realized or decided it would be freedom of speech, this defining aspect of political and social life in the US, the absolute right that is often claimed to the detriment and at great risk, including physical harm and death by the rulers of this country or the chief executive officer of our current administration. That right to speak one's mind at all times, regardless of the effects of it, is something that we wanted to look at more closely. Freedom of speech was also a theme that aligned very closely to our larger topic of art, positioning art as a political practice, and to look at what artists say as political practice, and therefore also at what institutions do supporting these artists as a political statement. The last and very important element of this beginning program was my invitation to Laura Rajkovic to join me as co-curator of the program. And then to immediately realize that the topic is vast, Laura's expertise deep, but we needed and wanted to interact and benefit from the experience and incredible knowledge present at various institutions here in the city that deal with freedom of speech. So before we did much else, we invited 4 organizations to join this year-long investigation. They are Article 19, the National Coalition Against Censorship, the New York Peace Institute, and Weeksville Heritage Society. And together then we developed these seminars, all of which are listed in the back of your extensive program and described inside it, and I won't take any more time to describe them. I want to thank the partner organizations for commitment to an idea that really was not much more than that, and sticking with it and joining us in curating, crafting, structuring the talks, providing us with speakers, often substantial ideas, and also in the case of Weeksville Heritage Center, the actual venue for an amazing program on seditious speech. I'd like to thank Gabriel Lopez-Dena, who is the curatorial advisor to assistant to our program. There you are. Marion Goodman Gallery has been extraordinarily generous. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Leslie Nolan. As usual, the New School faculty is generous, inquisitive, open-minded, and adventuresome, and I was really thrilled that quite a few New School faculty members are joining us tomorrow, really. Alexandra Wagner, there you are, is one of them who spoke in one of our seminars. My biggest thank, of course, goes to Barque Anwar, whose work has inspired what I do for at least 20 years, and I couldn't be more grateful and honored and also excited than I am about the collaboration between an institution and an individual artist and what has become of it and what will become of it after tonight. Thank you also to the advisory committee or the board of the Wherein Center that supports what we do in many different ways. And lastly, I want to welcome, it's not exactly necessary, but welcome Ariola Pira, introduce her as the curator of the Wherein Center, who joined us a few months ago, and I'm very glad that she's on board now. Laura, would you say a few words about the project and maybe the structure and our speakers tonight?
Okay. So thank you, Karen. It's been a pleasure, as always, to work on this project together that now has begun almost its second year. So it's quite remarkable. I think Karen and I have come at this project in a very specific way, kind of to explore the ideas that we are uncertain of. We've done this before, and it's yielded really great and wonderful things, and I think we've had an extraordinary experience. And I think one of the organizing principles that we employed to plan not only this 2-day convening, but also the conference but also the book that will subsequently be published, comes from one particular element of Anwar's work. And the film, Such a Morning, that Karen mentioned, captures a narrative arc of a professor who decides to take himself out of his daily circumstances in life to live in an abandoned train car in the forest. And he does this to encounter darkness and silence and solitude and really engage in an act of reconsideration. You have to watch the film. It's very beautiful. But at its ending, he emerges from the roof of the car and he begins to write letters. And Anwar has created a beautiful series of letters that are also artworks that capture where this thinking has brought the professor. And in the 7th letter, he describes It's the longest letter. He describes a remote convening where slow travel brings together a group of people in a distinctive forested mountain landscape. And then I just want to describe this letter because Karen and I used the letter to actually develop the slightly odd groupings and keywords that we used in the development of the convening. So within this lush bamboo forest, there's a maze of rooms and corridors, and the invited group of thinkers and writers and singers gather alongside a group of ink makers. And this group also contains a group of listeners that are specifically enumerated. The endless potential of the gathering is clear to all the participants, and they seem to understand the agenda without, in fact, laying it out. They engage in various forms of knowledge exchange, including the personal and the ideological, the geographically specific and the psychohistorical, and sometimes there's only silence between them. Other times they break down the systems that exist to enable some kind of transformation. There's a certain point where the relationship between humans and non-humans completely disintegrates, and a spree of murders take place, murders of both living and murders of both human and non-human participants. And they are mourned and the events analyzed by the group. At this point, those who have come to make the ink are ready to write, and they write an invitation for the next gathering, which takes place 1 year into the future, during which time a curriculum can be developed, a curriculum specifically for studies into darkness. And so, in organizing the closing convening for today and tomorrow, Karen and I took inspiration from this letter, and we identified several key moments around which we organized the sections of this gathering, which we hope will surface both what we have learned and as well as the questions that we've come up with along the way, specifically around the question of freedom of speech and how we confront this burning questions today in this very particular political and historical moment. And the process, in fact, has yielded and will continue to yield new elements of a curriculum, some of which you'll find in your program and eventually in the book as well. We begin tonight, in fact, with the final section of letter number 7, which we've called Silence and Transformation. We imagine this part of the journey to embody a withdrawal and silence as a generative site for thinking and future action. As well, it addresses the transformations that might be made possible through these states or ways of being. In a few moments, Barque Anwar and the poet and Indigenous language activist Natalie Diaz will take you into variations on this space of reflection. But before we get to them, I want to describe the organizing logic for these 2 days. We hope, of course, that you continue with us tomorrow when we'll begin with Arrival and Context, a group discussion by all the partners we have been fortunate to have on this journey, as Karen pointed out. Svetlana Mincheva from the National Coalition Against Censorship will lead us through a discussion. Just as in letter number 7, all the thinkers and writers and ink makers arrive and take in their surroundings, this conversation will bring to the table some of the questions that remain from our year-long discussions. This will be followed by Anticipation, which will bring the thinking of 2 artists, Shawnee McAleen Holloway and Vanessa Place, on how to make ready for the future. Sociology professor Alexandra Wagner and cultural historian and activist Kazembe Balagan will unpack their presentations like those gathered in letter 7 who arrived at the mountain, took in their surroundings, and began discussions and exchanges to inform their tasks. The second part of the day tomorrow will be devoted to Order and Disintegration, where an artist, Camila Janan Rashid, will make a presentation of her thinking on structures and their logics and how to interrupt and subvert them. Artist Chloe Bass and writer Aruna D'Souza will be respondents. This section of the letter is marked by the moment in which the relationships between human and non-human are undone and the murders occur, unwinding the order of the convening to make ready for the new subsequent invitation. Finally, tomorrow we'll close with a performance by Mendy and Keith Obadike, whose interpretations of Audre Lorde's writings might be imagined as the second invitation that ends letter number 7, which allows a year to, quote, search, identify, make collaborations, and develop the curriculum for studies into darkness, or in our case, freedom of speech. In a sense, our program for tonight and tomorrow is one form of this curriculum, as it holds some of the ever-expanding learnings on this subject of freedom of speech, which we will never conclude in our studies. These will also come together in the book I mentioned, which will contain further reflections from other participants, and it'll come out next year. So thank you for coming on this journey with us. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow and sharing the book. And now I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing Barque Anwar.
Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you to the partner organizations and the participants in this remarkable series of conversations. Thank you to Karen and Laura, and to all of you who have come here. I don't have a formal talk or a speech here tonight, in the sense of what people usually do and expect. I have a few thoughts about my work that I suppose begins with even more gratitude. Some years ago, when the need to make such a morning, to make the film, was making me a bit uncomfortable, I had suggested quite in passing to a close friend of mine and the cinematographer of the film, Dilip Verma. I had said, I wish to make a longer film, an unviable, unsustainable fiction, without any worry if it completely sank. And it would be a larger production, but why is it so difficult to make such a film? I wish we could just do a little trial. Why don't we shoot a bit and then see if it feels fine? Which is not the right kind of thing that you do, really, for a fiction feature. He replied quite immediately and said, let's do a trial. I'm really grateful. When I look back, I'm grateful that he said that, because it suddenly seemed quite simple to do. I was surprised and filled with a lot of relief, and we shot a bit. I'm also grateful to Samira Jain, another close friend who has edited most of my films. And I asked her even then that, can we just edit a day or two and see what it feels like, and drop it if it doesn't feel right? Or maybe edit a day or two every now and then, whenever we feel like. And she said, yes, it seems okay, and you could consider to continue filming. I'm grateful to a lot more people. To another close friend, I asked, can I begin without knowing how it's going to end? She said, of course, that's the best and only way. A simple answer, but for me it meant a lot. To my daughter, I asked, can I make it like the story I used to tell you? And she said, thank God you have finally understood what to make. To another, I asked, this is a film about blindness, but not only about the eyes, not only about the mind, but perhaps of the body as well. Perhaps about forgetting what we have forgotten. A certain kind of attenuation. Of what kind, I'm not even aware of. Again, I got a positive reply. I also asked, can it be a film where no one speaks, But this time, everyone was a bit doubtful about that question. But by then I felt a bit confident and carried on and went ahead. Because I was quite tired of speaking myself. It was difficult to make for many other reasons as well. Practically, to actually and completely make the train carriage where the professor would live was a daunting task or a daunting decision. But also in times such as these, where the normalization of violence was shifting to the open celebration of violence, it was important to resist, to speak out, and everyone was doing that. But I was tired of arguing. I felt the need to step back and to find another way to respond. Looking back at India as a nation state, its birth in 1947 and the execution of its imagination subsequently, again, it's not very hard to see that it has been accompanied by large-scale violence at every stage. In the last few weeks, and you can see quite easily, and I'm sure you have on the internet or in the newspapers, but in the last few weeks, with the intensification of the violent state occupation in Kashmir, we have, it seems, returned to 1947, almost as if we want to replay the massacres, but this time kill the ones who somehow survived, and even find newer and newer ways to do that. But since 1947, the scale and spectrum of violence has been so widespread in many other parts of the country that it's difficult to get a sense of it. When you live in such a situation where you cannot see all the parts of the violence, some of it becomes continuously invisible and the rest of the violence becomes normal. People don't necessarily like it or approve of it, but they come to terms with it. They accept it, they forget it, they adjust, and somehow you live with it. As you go along, sometimes you get an insight suddenly into what's happening. I remember several years ago, maybe in the late 90s, when I was filming in rural South Orissa in eastern India. And it's countryside and it's quite far in distance to get to. I came across a tarmac road that began from nowhere and went nowhere. In the middle of forests and fields, it just began and ended at a certain point. Nobody could figure out why this road was made. Some said it was to connect rural tribal markets or indigenous markets with the city, but the road actually made no practical sense. People eventually stopped wondering and talking about it. But 10 years later, or maybe 15 years later, the rationale for the road became quite clear, as it perfectly connected two parts of an industrial mining complex. What kind of a modern state was this that could conceive of a deception 10 to 15 years in advance? This was not about acquiring a small piece of land. This was about taking over entire hill ranges, rivers and agricultural lands, forests, based on geological surveys of the mineral seams. No one was pre-informed. The permission of affected communities was not taken, and a bewildered local population slowly understood the meaning and scale of the violence only after several years. This was supposed to be a government for the people. It is stunning to imagine the scale and impact of this violence, and even tougher to understand it or accept it. Uprooting communities, lands, forests, rivers continuously. If you go to that region now, you can see the devastation and the impact on the farming communities and the indigenous communities. What kind of a state does this to its own people? You can join the dots yourself and see. There are even permissions for aerial surveys for natural resources, for minerals, and so on, granted over a period of time. There is even insurance to protect financial investments from local resistance by the affected communities, if, of course, there is resistance. For the last 5, 10, 15 years, we now see a reinvention of another kind of national identity with greater and greater intensity, and the reconstruction of traitors and patriots binaries, something that I'm sure you're familiar with as well. Good people and bad people. We're also familiar, and we have been familiar, with increasing disaffection towards the Indian state. And obviously, even with the so-called sedition, alongside this process in the last several decades have been series of remarkable non-violent civil society actions, initiatives, and resistance that have been inspiring and kept us all optimistic. However, often one still feels indifferent, helpless, as the scale and complexity of the violence is too large, and one tends to look away and let the madness continue. For me, it's been hard to understand that in the last decade or so, we have had roughly 200,000 suicides by farmers. Unofficial figures are perhaps a lot more. But still, 200,000 or more farmers have killed themselves in India. The scale and meaning of this is incredibly hard to comprehend. What's also hard to accept is that there's been no political force of any kind, no civil society initiative, no group of us good people who have brought this state or this great nation to a complete grinding halt because of these suicides. Nations have gone to war with each other for 1/10 of this number killed, but we haven't managed to stop this helpless, voluntary mass murder. Quite obviously, it seems, if one looks back, that the so-called good people, whoever and wherever they are, have failed at many levels. We haven't been able to offer a viable alternative, political, cultural, and economic vision, or resistance. Even though the state often comes across as a brutal, amorphous system, it is also quite obvious that this system just doesn't act on its own. It continuously builds an institutional, systemic impunity alongside. And there are individuals taking decisions within it. Real people take several small decisions every day within the system to make it work the way it does. It is also clear that there is a large public on the outside that supports the violence of the state, is proud of it, and they are speaking in an even louder voice now. Increasingly, I found it difficult to make sense of this silent desire for violence, this unshakable prejudice, and our bewildering selective indifference. I felt the need to step back a bit, to reconceive and reconfigure, possibly, another response. And I wondered, what would I see if I were to enter into the heart of darkness? What could be the vision from within a zone of non-vision? One of the first things that the professor realizes once inside darkness is that if there's no light, you see nothing. So you need some light to even see darkness. And then you see soon that there are many kinds of darknesses. And then you see light change as the time passes, and the darknesses also keep changing. And then the wind blows, and the darknesses change again, and so on. Many things happen. Small events occur, and he learns to wait, to look, and to allow another sense to live and grow. As the story proceeds, a new character emerges. A middle-aged woman armed with a rifle inside her house, as if almost eternally on guard. What does it mean to live in apprehension forever? I had wondered once. Days, months pass, and perhaps it seems even years go by, until one day a group of men, workers, appear suddenly and begin to dismantle her house brick by brick, window by window. As we struggle to see and understand, it becomes possible that the present moment is actually in the past. And perhaps it even may be something that is yet to happen. All explanations suddenly become valid. How could that be possible? Who is the author of the story? Who is telling? As it seems that at times I am the author, then it seems that he is the author, and then it seems she is the author, and then again it becomes fluid and the authors start interchanging. Why didn't she fire when they dismantled her house? What was she reading when they took it apart? Was she reading, telling his story? Did the destruction occur in real time? Or was it in the past? Or was it something that she was predicting and could actually see? Did she get destroyed? Or did she actually get released and freed? Is the house a construct in her mind? Of what? Or was the house her mind? Or his mind? Was he her? Or was she him? When the professor begins to re-engage, he writes a series of letters. This is his first letter, perhaps appropriate where we are. Dear Chancellor, I write to you from the depth of darkness. May I humbly inform you that I think the curriculum of the university needs to be changed. It is now clear to me that there are 49 types of darknesses. 21 of these are within, and the rest are on the outside. I would recommend base studies in all of these so as to prepare for a new journey of learning, without which we will continue on this path of self-destruction. In the film, he writes 3 more letters, one to his colleagues, to his students, and then to the children who lived in his street. Each of these letters emerge from different traditions, religious traditions, philosophical traditions, metaphysical traditions in the subcontinent. We have obviously dealt repeatedly with several basic questions of living, of meaning, and of dying. After the film is over, the story continues outside the film. He keeps writing his letters, and the story leaves the film and comes out in another form. Here, I collaborate with Sharna Dastur, and she makes and conceives the paper for each of the letters, and so they all take on another form and are presented in an installation with projections and lights. His 5th letter is open, addressed to the public. His 6th letter has no words and can only be seen or experienced. His 7th letter is to his friends, to people who might come together, such as this evening. It is an invitation to come together, but it also describes the coming together, even as it invites you. I skip the first half of the letter and read the second part, which is about 400 words, in case you get worried in between. The first day began on the question of maybe. It seemed perhaps that it was possible, though it could also be said to not be so. Several discussions were like 2 tangents on an invisible circle. Their eventual meeting point was carefully observed and noted. A psycho-historical analysis of the omnipresent phenomenon of arrogance was combined with the living habits of unknown birds. Sudden transformations of intuitions and comprehensions into images, sounds, or words were immediately noted. Calculations to derive the location, dimensions, probability of occurrence, possible trajectory, and methodologies to predict, sense, and analyze the impact of the blind spot was combined with the study of visible and invisible institutions. strategies used by individuals and communities to camouflage, conceal, deceive, adapt, survive, and resist were studied along with the experiences learned from the growing and trade of potatoes, onions, and medicinal plants. The study of dictators, their personal lives, and the ideological systems that create them was paired with the knowledge gained from the annual and intergenerational travels of a pastoralist community on a particular route across several fields, forests, and nations. Such an intermingling often created a vast silence that spread long into the night. The urgency of multiple streams racing down the slopes into the rice field seemed for a moment the only contact with people anymore. Night was surprisingly spectacular. The stars were near and up close. The wind kept changing directions, making the bamboo corridors whistle. The wooden whispers of night-long tunes and the fragrance of passing clouds cleansed everyone as they slept. Rules, hierarchies, and systems of negotiations between humans, humans and non-humans, non-humans and non-humans were presented in 4 languages, 3 that had scripts and 1 did not. The transformation of meanings between them was examined carefully. Then began 3 days and nights about murders, carefully selected but across all beings, described carefully, analyzed in great detail, and lamented in verse and song too. By now the inks were ready, crushed, mixed, boiled, diluted, thickened, tested. In total, 49 inks were created: hard black, blue black, brown black, gray black, soft crusty black, striped sparse black, reddish black, and so on. The little bottles kept getting filled up and the writing began. A teller and a singer would accompany each set of texts for all that was not possible to write. The second invitation was drafted. The date for the next meeting was announced. 4 seasons of time was allocated. Just a little over a year was left to search, identify, make collaborations, and develop the curriculums for the 49 base studies into darkness. Thank you for responding to the letter 7 and choosing your darkness as the freedom of speech. Doing that has created such a wonderful series of explorations, given us all so much, and has brought us here too. Darkness for me was never something negative. My only criteria at the beginning when we met and discussed was to choose a darkness that you felt was important and needed to be re-understood, reconfigured, in your area where you came from, where you are. And that we should begin from a position of not knowing and try and keep it that way all through. And that it should be shareable, what we learn later for everyone. My initial reaction at the beginning was that the darkness should have been just speech. For speech itself had become so complicated. But of course, freedom of speech was and is more important and gives us a real direction for the future. The research is extremely valuable for everyone, I think, all over the world. As I think perhaps for almost everyone, all words are often suddenly losing complete meaning. Once we manage to put it together step by step, I think it will allow anyone, anywhere, to set up a course and teach and try and understand the basic issues and the new ones as they've emerged, been understood, been articulated. Some years ago, during the making and showing of another work, The Sovereign Forest, we realized that it had become very difficult to understand what was being lost the meaning, scale, and implications of the loss. Of land, of livelihoods, of habitats, of cultures, of life itself. It had even become difficult to comprehend the meaning and scale of the crime too. Since all the evidence was visible, why could we not see? Why did the crime not stop? Perhaps it seemed we were not comprehending fully. Perhaps we could not see, could not sense anymore. Perhaps the official, legal, formal definition of evidence itself was wrong. Maybe now legally invalid evidence needed to be placed on the table for the justice system and everyone who depended on it to comprehend. Maybe this invalid, inadmissible evidence had to be poetry, and that poetry as evidence was the only way to finally fully comprehend the meaning and scale of the crime and of loss, and to do it formally, not just metaphorically. If we do not even know what is lost, how can we respond? As we continued to make, we found that we were making different routes in varied vocabularies so as to come closer and closer actually towards the same thing. The meaning of what was lost of life itself. Each route gave us a different understanding, a unique insight of its own about the same thing. In a while, it became clear that what was valuable was not what you understood at the end of each route or from each insight, but actually the shifts in between the routes. The shift from one way of understanding to another way, to another way, and to another way of the same thing. The experience of the shift, the traveling in between, that was what created sudden moments of temporary understanding, of momentary comprehensions. And these were not necessarily cerebral understanding. Something else was also happening. And in a way, you could feel different parts of your body comprehending. Different senses were there and could be possible. And that comprehension was momentary, and that was fine. It should be. It can be like that. And you accumulate a bit by bit as you go along. When you make, for instance, an archive, you get amazed by everything you have collected. Even a book is an archive. But the real value perhaps lies in its inadequacy. The fact that it suddenly gives you a sense of all that is not there, of what is unknown, or what one does not know as yet. Its inadequacy seems to be its true value. It gives you the most valuable sense of that what you do not know, a sense that was critical, not a full understanding, but partial, a part touching another part, in many ways, a relationship in many dimensions, not all within reach. Hearing the fascinating speakers who had come here, when I was here earlier as well as online, and reading as much as I could all this year around about them and what they did here as well as elsewhere, or said. And as I shifted from speaker to speaker, seminar to seminar, in the in-between, in the shifts, I realized that the series was not really only about freedom of speech, but actually about freedom itself. They re-articulated across times, regions, eras, communities, traditions, ways of thinking, experiences, insights into the question of what freedom itself actually meant, could mean, was fought for, could be fought for, and therefore what it still can mean. And it is only because of them, the speakers, and I take no blame. I am tempted to actually suggest to you another darkness, another curriculum. how might we organize? What structures or non-structures, methods or processes are possible for us so as to be able to re-articulate, reconfigure, and respond more effectively across countries, cultures, and communities? Institutions do not necessarily have to be fixed, visible, and have assets. Institutions can be processes too. They can be fragile. They can fail, be fluid, can appear, disappear, re-emerge in another form, be silent for long, surface for a while, and yet be consistent and sustainable for decades. For several years, we have been familiar with, if I can call it, an analog neurosis. We've seen it in our families, in our streets, in our communities, locally, and I think as we grow and as we live, we understand it and begin to understand it quite well. But in the last few years, we have experienced the tapping of this neurosis digitally and the transmission and the use of our inner selves across the world, minute by minute, into our hands and pockets round the clock. What might be the collective strategy and structure of our response in such a future? How can we organize but also address the desire for violence and the pleasure of vengeance and selective indifference and the delusion of self-deception in us, the so-called good people as well, and not just out there? When I asked this same last question recently to a nomad in India, a camel and sheep herder, while researching another curriculum of darkness, he replied without a pause, immediately. He said, "There is so much blood now accumulated here, deep in the soil, all over, that the only way to begin is with generosity." Thank you.
Just to explain that we now have this incredible privilege of hearing Natalie Diaz follow this presentation with her own. The two of them have not met, so there was no coordination between the speakers. And we thought it would be appropriate today to leave it at these two presentations, and we invite you and hope you will join us tomorrow when we're going to come together again in this space, and when there will be many opportunities for Q&A and questions and suggestions. But for now, for today, maybe we leave it to the poets among us, Anwar and now Natalie.
Gracias por venir. It's my luck to be here. Karin, Laura, all of Ariel, all the work you have been doing. Speak louder. Okay. And gracias, Amar, for your work. It's been incredible. I was lucky to be invited by Karin to begin thinking. And in a way, it was maybe a bit presumptuous of me, but to imagine myself thinking alongside your work and a lot of the other conversations that have taken place. I wonder about any colonial settler state language. So freedom of speech is not something that I necessarily will wave as a flag of being a measure of the way I want to exist in this country, the way I want to exist. And I'm also very curious about anything we begin to call a right, especially knowing that most of the rights designated in this country did not include here, at least half of us in the room. So some of the questions that I have been asking, and I'm going to share some images that I made in kind of the space of thinking alongside this, but also thinking alongside Tina Kampt, who I will mention a little bit later. What if the settler colonial state holds me still, and my only movement is through projection? As an Indigenous woman, as a Latinx woman, as a queer woman, the way I exist largely is already what you believe you know of me. What of speech, what of text do I need to remove, erase, or refuse in order to exist? So I acknowledge that this active image, the images that I will be showing, are not freedom. These images are simply me speaking from within the state with state markers, which is what freedom of speech is to me. It's a marker of the state. Maybe. In a silence that I will never know if it is chosen or if it is required or expected of me. So freedom of speech in one of these lenses is a prophecy of the settler colonial state. In my first year of language work with my elders at Fort Mojave, the reservation where I was born and grew up, I had an experience that changed the way I think about language, especially the English American language, the language through which my people have been rendered, assimilated, forgotten, displaced, extracted from, traumatized, disappeared. The language by which my goodness, my success, my freedoms have been measured and granted. It was at an early evening meeting with a Mojave elder teacher and some adult learners. One of the learners was a 45-year-old woman who has an 8-year-old son and was also the niece of the teacher. The learner had asked how to say, "I love you" in Mojave, to which her aunt, our teacher, replied, "We don't say that." This was not new information. In the many archived documents I had come across in that first year of research, there were notes commenting on the fact that we, Mojaves, had no word for love. The linguists, anthropologists, and ethnographers had asked the same question. Along their list of elicitations, how do you say good morning? How do you say good night? How do you say I'm hungry? How do you say heaven? How do you say I love you? Our ancestors replied the same way. We don't have words for that. And so these questioners drew a visual conclusion, a usual conclusion. We didn't have a word for it, so we must not feel it. Didn't they tell you that I was a savage? But that night in class, the learner broke at hearing again that we had no word for I love you. She needed more. I went my whole life without my parents ever telling me they loved me, she said, and I won't let my son go through that. She was crying. Her aunt said, "What is it you really want to say?" "I want to say," she said, and she held her hand to her chest and gestured outward as if her son was right there, standing with us in the room. "I want him to know." She trailed off. "Okay," our teacher said, "we have words for that." That night, we learned to say in Mojave, "I will keep you so close as to be called stingy with you. You are mine. You are mine in that you are a piece of me. You are my heart, you are my eye, you are my best pottery, and finally, I will die for you." The first documents I read that recorded the fact, the data, that Mojaves didn't say I love you were from 1901 and 1902, the same year of a census that changed our people's names. They lined up the Mojaves and renamed them. Abraham Lincoln, George and Martha Washington, Rip Van Winkle, Robin Hood. To this day, we have families whose last names are Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. Since 1901 and 1902, we have lived, at least partly, and then eventually completely in translation. Our translators have been the settler colonial state, English, America. And that translation told us we didn't love, and so we didn't deserve to be loved. That has been one condition I've lived in. My mother also never heard her parents say, "I love you." I'm beginning here because in order for me to exist, I need to, and I need you to also, set aside the contexts of freedom of speech and remember the conditions. The conditions of the state this freedom renders and upholds. The conditions of settler colonialism. When we refuse to forget the conditions, then we can understand that when white Americans tried to explain love to my Mojave ancestors and family, it was an absurdity. These people who were treating us this way, the cavalry wiped out large numbers of our Mojave with syphilis from raping our women and left many of my people blind. The beaver trappers destroyed our river. They roped our children like cattle and tied them to the back of wagons and took them to a boarding school. Mojave women were known and documented to be breastfeeding their children through the fence. So when they tried to explain love to us, it was we who could not imagine that these people felt it. And we who knew the word that might lead to these actions was not a word, not an action we wanted to invoke. In this case, to not say was to not act, to not make happen. To not say was to remain out of time, out of context, outside of the state. What is silence or quiet in relation to the native? To deny the noise of the state and citizenship and the right to speak by refusing to pledge allegiance to language. The First Amendment, in its rendering of refusing to speak, specifically links it to the Pledge of Allegiance, as if that would be like one of the your main resistances is not to pledge allegiance to that flag. How silenced am I when I speak in the settler colonial language, whose Declaration of Independence still refers to people like me, people connected to their lands and waters that they must plunder as merciless Indian savages? I am here speaking now, or at least I am speaking in a language through which everyone in this room can see themselves. But where is my body? Where is the native body? In the museum, it's quiet. As a mascot on a football helmet, quiet. Street signs, highway exits, names you can't pronounce, so quiet. In death, too, perfectly quiet. What or who am I giving away every time I speak? What of myself, my fullness, disappears when I become the ego? If you are, where are those who are not here? Not here. Every time your freedom of speech is exercised, who is disappeared? Or crossing a desert in the dark of night, not making a sound? Who is in a cell somewhere, reiterated as non-citizen every time we enact citizenship? If you are, where are who are not? Not. You are you, not those. You are here, here. I am not. To remain outside the state takes a toll, in such a way that a body fails. To resist the state requires new configurations of the body. An old configuration that has seen a resurgence is joy. We demand joy. We build it. We remind ourselves of it. We joy and joy. We say, see this joy, it is resistance. And it is a lucky thing. It is also a hard-won context considering our conditions. This country was not built on the conditions of joy. Can joy spring from the seed of genocide? What if, as my friend Roger Reeves says, we resist by finally saying, I am exhausted? When I said earlier to remain outside the state takes a toll, I mean to remain outside the state imaginatively while living within the state takes a toll. My therapist said to me recently, you cannot live in the imagination. These are her actual words. I take notes when I'm in there. I figure, as much as I'm paying, I can maybe get a poem out of it. You cannot live in the imagination. You must come back to this dimension where you have the requirements of a normal human being, to sleep a certain number of hours to regenerate body cells. You don't move the same way in outer space as you do on Earth. There is gravity. Natalie, you do not escape these rules. And I said to her, because I pay her a lot of money so I can say what I want, but what if in the imagination is the only place I can exist in a settler colonial state? What then becomes of language, of speech, of action in the conditions of my imagination? In Toni Morrison's beloved, Sixo stopped speaking English because there was no future in it. That's one of my main wonders about freedom of speech, is what is the future of it? Where does it happen in time? What does a settler colonial state depend on of my resistance to fuel its imagination? For every act of freedom of speech, how does the state leap into its next iteration? And then where do I situate myself in relation to that? How do I stay moving or shifting or changing in relation to freedom of speech? For example, after Standing Rock, 4 states created new laws increasing the severity of penalties for protecting water and land, for treating water and land as an ancestor, as having a voice, as being alive. And there are 3 other states right now who are trying to increase the severity of punishment. And there are 5 Indigenous activists still imprisoned right now, facing 30 plus years in jail. To express care was a fuel to the imagination of the settler colonial mind. When we traffic in freedom of speech, we iterate it to give us the power to act or to be heard in the, quote, now. What do we need to shift of time? Where in time does freedom of speech operate? Do we believe freedom of speech changes the system? Can we also believe simultaneously that it reinforces the structure of power in which the settler colonial state exists? What if true freedom of speech is an acknowledgement not of what I can say or want to say, but a question of what I do not have the language for yet, either because it does not yet exist or it has been forgotten? What if freedom of speech is never about the present? What if we imagine it as a language before the beginning and always becoming? Is all language in a settler colonial state language either for or against the state? What can my speech mean within the context of the state? If I ask the state for freedom, the state's freedom, freedom within the state, is it really freedom I am asking for? Or when I ask for freedom, am I asking for an acknowledgement of my wounds, wounds the state still has its fingers in? It is not the wound, my elders say. It is not the wound that hurts, it is the scar. The scar is what makes you remember. And so can you know freedom if you have never been held, captured, or immobilized? What is freedom within a settler colonial state, and what is speech? What are we failing to imagine of it? What old language must we return to so that we do not replicate it, so that we do not speak only to the state? I want to divest from speech, from what is American, except I am. I am American. I work in language. Does my language have to uphold the state and reiterate my place within it? Does my belief in and embrace of freedom of speech require me to beg the state to let me enter? The stone can enter me, but I can never enter the stone. If the state acknowledges my voice, my language of body and sound, then I am no longer me. Then I am an extension of the state. I use the state's language. I am noisy with the state. All of us here in this room are ruckus with nation. We sing America so it remains a song. Joy Harjo said, I am singing a song that can only be born after losing a country, and it must be lost. Freedom of speech under the conditions of the settler colonial state is necessarily a return to a time before the state, as much as it is a leap toward what is not yet said, before the beginning and always becoming, to the time when we had no word for freedom. I asked my teacher what our word for freedom was, and he said, who needed freedom? It was already everything, so it could not be something. My wonder about freedom of speech is that it is in time, and I need it to be out of time. Movement toward the beyond of settler colonialism. Tina Compt, when imagining how a Black feminist might think in the grammar of futurity, said, it is a tense of anteriority. The grammar of Black feminist futurity is a performance of a future that hasn't happened but must. To put it another way, she said, it is a form of prefiguration, which requires living the future now as imperative rather than as subjunctive. Future in Mojave, another word I had to ask my teacher for because it's not a word we have. The most urgent word of time we have is Nyamatham, and it means tomorrow. It only means tomorrow because it means morning. It comes from the word Nyamathav, which means gray, so it's a description of that color when you would begin your day. That was the most urgent time we had, was in the morning. When I asked him for the word for future, and this is something like he's been, we started a new school on our reservation, so it's something he's been trying to think about, is how to talk with these young people about what is waiting for them up ahead. And so we have a word called Isam, and it means to look across a distance, but it has a physicality with it. So you would never say Isam, you would say Isam. So it requires you to lift up and to look out. It's physical, but future for us is an actual place. And this was, when I was reading Comp's Listening to Images, it was something that really spoke to me, and it was something I read as I was making these images, like to imagine what has not yet been imagined, but is a place I will arrive to. So freedom in Mojave is a place which requires my movement toward it always. It's that lifting up, Isam. It's the place I can see. It's always a physical place, not an impossibility, but as we also say, it's Sumach Ahot, which for us is a place that has been dreamed for you that you will arrive at. So it's not the dream that happens when you go to sleep, but it's a dreaming that says there is a place there waiting for you to arrive in it. And so there's a way that I can think about being here now, and even not knowing Amar's work before, that this was waiting here for me to arrive at. So this was a future that, even if I'm not sure how to imagine it, is a real place that I will arrive at and be ready in it. So that idea of waiting, waiting to arrive there. So for me, a big question is, does my exercise of freedom of speech keep the state in balance? I think a lot about when something is so, one force of power is so large, it requires our resistance. It's like a wave. It requires us to have a certain amount of resistance in order for it to maintain its power. And so that's something I'm wondering about, the ways we talk about freedom of speech, the way we exercise freedom of speech. And it reminds me of the Hortense Spillers from Mama's Babies, Papa's Maybes, an American grammar book, that incredible intro sentence. My country needs me And if I were not here, I would have to be invented. And so in order for freedom of speech to happen, we are completely in acknowledgement that we need those without it. And so it's a question I have of, when I say trafficking and freedom of speech, that's what I mean is, how am I always and ever implicit? And what does it mean to resist it? And I'll end on a couple things. The idea of not saying, I've been thinking a lot about silence. I've been thinking about it in relationship to athletics and to sport, especially in regard to Colin Kaepernick and when he took the knee. And immediately after that happened, he was giving a lot of talks. He was, doing a lot of interviews. And there was something about his sound, his noise, his speech that felt safe. It was when he quit giving interviews, when he became quiet, suddenly the danger lifted, and that's when a lot of the repercussions started to happen, is when he took advantage of that silence by saying without saying, or by refusing to speak in the language of trafficking, that traffic language that is always explaining. And so this is a small example. To not say is to exist by existing outside of the center. And this example is that first year of language work, I was working off of, in a way, I had some conversational Mojave, but I was working off a lexicon or vocabulary list of elicitations that someone had already asked. And so I was working off of this dictionary that made a white linguist's career. She made it off of coming to our reservation. And I had seen the word for zebra. And so she had come and asked one of my elders, how do you say zebra? This is in Fort Mojave, Arizona on the Colorado River. And we had, they had not left that area. And I saw that, and there was a definition listed there. But I was lucky enough to find the recordings of that elicitation. They were on wax cylinders. And I was listening to it with my teacher. And when they got to zebra, he started laughing. And I was still too new in the language I didn't know. And he started laughing. And I was like, what are you laughing about? And he's like, so this woman said, how do you say zebra? And my elder's answer was, why did you paint that horse? And so that it was really funny, because there were moments in the tape when the ancestor did not answer. She was just quiet. But she must have just had it. I mean, by the time you get to Z, after listening all those letters, by the time she got to Z, she said, okay, F this is basically what she said at that point. But that was the response she gave, was, why did you paint that horse? And it ended up being put into the dictionary as painted horse, which is, kind of, it was just an interesting lesson for me to see, a language that was silent for 80 to 90 years because it was not allowed to be spoken. And then to have this opportunity to speak it and to watch my elders say, I'm not going to participate in what this freedom. I'm going to find ways to stay outside of the center. And so just some ending thoughts and wonders. Is freedom of speech a collective resistance? Does it require the other? Is it only for the citizen? Does it have an intention? If so, what is the intention of freedom of speech? I feel like sometimes we always think we know these things. Does freedom of speech ask us to consider how we say or act? Or does it let us forget tenderness of language because we are so engaged in the power of the state? It's an interesting relationship, I think, with freedom of speech. A thing I don't trust myself in is that sometimes in basketball, you're pushing up against somebody, like you want to find their body and press up against it. So you think, okay, this is so I know where I'm at on the court. But then suddenly you realize, actually, they're directing me on the court. And so what happens if you remove yourself, if you take yourself out of that tension? And so I wonder a lot, sometimes freedom of speech becomes in some ways our anger or our reaction to, but I wonder where intentionality exists sometimes in freedom of speech. Is freedom of speech only ever urgent? So what does it mean when it happens easily? What is it when we forget it has a value in our hope for the settler colonial state? Because in a way, I think freedom of speech is our hope that there is hope for the settler colonial state. It has morality. It has, it's going to one day recognize us all. How can freedom of speech exist if we can't possibly know its value? As of yet, no U.S. American poet has lost their life for a poem they have written. That feels like a really important question to me, to think about what it means when I write a poem against the state or toward the state, or even trying to pretend I'm going the opposite direction. What power can there be if there has only ever been power in that language? To be pushed out of a center, the American settler colonial center of the human, was intended. As Lord and others have said, it is meant to depersonalize us. And this is something I think is a really important part of the settler colonial state, is that freedom of speech centers us in a way that disconnects us from all the things that would possibly let us exist, which is land and water. But this depersonalization, I wonder, this might be our greatest power, the greatest constellating of our strength. If we are out of the center and so connected to one another through land and water, which has always been called an indigenous connection, it's not the same experience or context of suffering, but it's the same condition of intense communion with and reverence for and language of and stories from land and water. And so in some ways, there are many of us who are indigenous. Those who were here from before the beginning, those with lineages of enslavement, those migrating or fleeing from one land to another, crossing one land or another, one water or another. But settler colonialism does not allow for this constellation, because it holds us to freedom of speech, which sometimes I wonder if that is just a distraction from who we become and what we might say when we hold language in our bodies, when we recognize language as land and our body as connected to land. So I'm just going to end on this. We're silent right now, and it's possible that you've chosen to be silent. Of course you don't have to be, or maybe you do have to be because we are right now within a certain template. We're in a very settler colonial template. There's a podium here. But I'm just going to ask you with me just briefly, because again, I think freedom of speech, taken outside of the context of urgency, what does it mean? So if we were to enact freedom of speech right now, what is it that you want to say? Also, what can you afford not to say? So we just think on those things with me. What do you want to say? What can you afford not to say? What must you say right now? Or does freedom of speech only operate in urgency? What must you say right now? So if you were to tell the person next to you the thing that you must say, think about the words and the language you need to say it. What must you say now? What language and words do you need to say it? And so right now, maybe you're poised to lean to the person next to you to say it, but I'm going to ask you to keep those words and to turn them towards silence. But let them move in you, visit them, enter them in silence. And in 1 week, I'm going to ask you to email me a voice memo of what must be said. Because one of the things I wonder is what must be said only in relation to who will hear it? Is what must be said only in relation to what you hope it will invoke or shift or change in them? Is what must be said only in relation to how it carries your body, your desires, your fears and wants? And so to think, how will this saying, this speech, this act of saying become practice for you this week? And then I'll offer you this wonder of mine. And this is what I think about when I think of freedom of speech. Because I have spoken earlier today, all day today, because I have spoken with you tonight, right now, who has not? Who is quiet for my voice? And so I'm just gonna escape this and do. I think I can type into this, or maybe not. Oh, the text box. Oh, is there already one up there?
Yeah, next to
Okay. Oh, because I'm on a blank template, huh? And if you have a smartphone, it's easy. You can just send a voice memo there. I guess I can make this a little bigger. Fix one problem, you start another. But yeah, so just something to kind of, again, like to kind of leave with. If you can just think about those things. Because I think what feels important to me is that freedom of speech, one, is completely in question and always in question, but also to imagine what it might mean if it meant something in every hour of our day, because it definitely means that to some people. Anyway, gracias for sharing some of these thoughts.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. We hope to see you tomorrow in this space at 1:30 for 3 sessions, and then for a performance organized by Mandy and a reception, a festive reception, I think the program says, at 5 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Natalie.